This happened a year ago or so on a camping trip with my dad in late July or early August. It was a weekend trip, and we were the only ones at the campground. For privacy purposes, I will not state the name of the park we were camping at. I will say, though, that it was in the state of Indiana. Anyway, I woke up with a start one night in my tens. Checking the time on my phone, it read 3:30 a.m. I was hesitant at first to get out of the tent, but my bladder was screaming, which forced me to get up. The sounds of the forest I would have at any other time found comforting, but this time, for some reason, it unnerved me. About 50 yards away and uphill was a porta potty, and since I'm a girl, I can't just pee in the woods. So I grabbed my headlamp, which my mom had loaned to me, turned it on, and headed to the porta potty. I was talking to myself in an attempt to calm my nerves, mostly because I was complaining about my bladder and how dim the headlamp was. The light was so faint that it only illuminated 5 feet in front of me, so I ended up relying on the light of the moon to guide me. I made it to the porta potty without incident, relieved my bladder, then headed back to the tent. Once I was about halfway there, it struck me. The forest was now silent, eerily silent. My mind began imagining the horrors of what was lurking in those woods. Skinwalkers, wendigos, Bigfoots, who were just waiting for me to get in range so they could snatch me up and eat me. With the speed of an Olympic runner, I sprinted the last 20 yards back to camp. The headlamp's light almost died. Upon arriving at camp and catching my breath, I got the sensation I was being watched, which really started to freak me out. I turned to face the tree line that bordered the lake and saw a pair of large, yellow golden eyes. My tent is very close to this tree line, so whatever this thing was, it was less than 15 feet away. Frozen in fear, I stared back at the eyes. Then my headlamp's light went out, but the eyes of this thing were still glowing. I am a rational person, so I figured it was a coyote or a very large stray dog, and my headlamp's light was just reflecting off of the eyes, giving the illusion that they were glowing. So when my headlamp's light went out, I expected the eyes to do the same. However, they did not. They were indeed glowing a gold yellow. Terrified, I took a few steps back and lost my balance, falling straight onto my butt. The eyes were getting closer, and the moonlight shone on this creature, revealing a silhouette that in no way matched the size of a coyote or a dog. This thing was far larger and appeared to be on its hind legs. If I had to guess, this creature stood taller than 6 feet and had a hunched-over body. It had the head of a dog. If I had to take a guess, it looked like the head was the shape of a husky or one of those wolf dogs or something. Now, I know most people, when they talk about encountering these dog men, they mention a strong feeling of malevolence coming from the creature. But oddly enough, I kind of felt the opposite. The eyes of the creature did not seem to hold any sort of malice or intent to harm me. Rather, I got the sense that it was curious, or at the very least confused. After engaging in a staring contest with this creature, which probably lasted only a minute, the creature got back to all fours and retreated into the forest. But it seemingly made no sound as it did so. I don't know if this was a dog man. I know for sure it wasn't a bear. We don't even have grizzlies in Indiana, and black bears aren't all that common. I'm at a loss as to what this creature was. It left no tracks behind in the muddy banks of the lake, which seems almost impossible. Well, what do you guys think? When I was a kid, I was already a very lonely one. I had almost no friends and was only a child for the first decade of my life, and so my younger brothers were born. So to make up for the lack of human interaction in my life, I was known for having a fertile imagination. Wherever I went, wherever it was, all my family says that they remember me having more imaginary friends than any kid could imagine. They weren't just your common made of goofy creatures or the princess still waiting for the prince, though. They were many mythological creatures, like fairies, dwarves, or sometimes small dragons. That may be one of the things that may come in handy later, as I'm not sure myself if what I saw was real or just the imagination of a kid who was so scared that they tried to make an excuse for something seemingly completely normal. I'm 15 as I'm writing this, though to tell this story we have to go back when I was around 8 or 9. I was living in Portugal back then, and I still am to this day, with the exception that now we live in the capital and not in the outskirts of a smaller city. But that's not important for this story right now. But what's important, however, is that when I was younger, my mother and I used to go with her friends on small trips south to a beach fairly known for tourism, and we went there every summer without an exception until this happened. On this particular year, it was only me, my mother, and one of her friends, who dragged his nephew who was my age along. Which names it'll be easier, though for privacy reasons I'll have to change them. Let's say that my mom's friend is Vitor, and the boy is Alfonso. As soon as we arrived to the small makeshift parking lot, me and Alfonso immediately jumped out of the car, grabbing our beach toys and sprinting to the beach. Neither of the adults were worried, since they knew that we were smart kids and wouldn't go further than the place where the water met the sand. So they took their time, taking some of the crucial things from the car trunk, and eventually met up with us on the beach itself. The day was overall fun and rather relaxed, at least until we decided to go into the water for the last time before heading to the cabin where we would be staying for the night. So, while my mom was taking some baths, me, Vitor, and Alfonso went for one last swim. About 10 minutes passed normally, and we are playing tag in the water. I was hiding under the surface so it would be harder for them to spot me, when suddenly a pain in my right leg made me scream underwater. Before I knew it, I was being pushed to the depths of the lake, the pain only increasing as something seemed to dig into my flesh, my arms reaching just above the water to signal that I needed help or trying to swim away from this senseless grip. It's amazing how the human can be so strong when its life depends on it. After a while, my overall wimpy body gave up, and I was dragged further into the bottom. My eyes started to make everything darker or fuzzier. Last thing I remember would scare me for life. A gigantic, dragon-like creature in an ill shade of green and traumatizing glowing amber eyes was almost biting my leg off. I was in such a state of shock, I think I must have blacked out. It wasn't until later I'd wake up with the warmth in my cabin's room, my aching leg now bandaged up. I immediately screamed for my mom, who was just casually walking in after hearing me call out for her. First thing I remember asking was, "Did you get the monster?" "What monster?" my mom asked with a perplexed look on her face. "The mosh that pushed me into the water," I overwhelmingly screeched, getting a scold from my mother for it, as her shouting is a very offensive term here. Blame the fact that Iberian languages make you seem like you're screaming at someone half of the time. "What are you talking about? There was no monster there, just stepped too deep into the water." I don't know what exactly happened after, but I do remember a lot of arguing with my mother after trying to convince her that it was something beyond natural that had done this to me. One thing I'm sure of though, if I simply lost my foot in the water, how come that was able to have a tooth-like scar on my leg? That just doesn't make any sense, and I can't quite explain it. But I know what happened, and it doesn't matter what anyone else says.
This happened back when I was 12 or 13 years old. Now, a little backstory here. My dad and I volunteered at a bird banding station. If you don't know what bird banding is, it's where researchers put small metal bands on the legs of birds and then release them to track their migration patterns. We'd set out mist nets in the woods to catch the birds. We used nets instead of traditional traps so we wouldn't harm the birds. So anyway, the guy who owned the bird banding station and the entire property, let's call him R, was let me wander the woods while he was collecting birds out of the nets. R's property was massive, with woods, countryside, marshland, you name it. Now back to the story. It was a cool summer morning. I was wandering in my usual part of the forest. It wasn't long before I noticed that it was unusually silent, which was odd. I usually hear at least one thrush or blue jay, but there was nothing. All of a sudden, in the distance, I hear what sounds like a distressed baby deer or cat. Being the curious animal lover I was, I followed the noise. However, as I got closer to the sound, it seemed to grow a lot further away. It wasn't long before I came to the edge of R's property. The wailing sounded like it was coming from nearby 1 minute, from sounding far away the next. Despite being confused and a little creeped out, I still followed it. A few moments later, I came across a small deer blind. I looked inside to see if anyone was messing with me, but nobody was there. When I got a better look at the blind, I noticed something a little bit off about it. It looked like there were massive slashes on the sides. They looked like if a person had slashed them with a knife or an animal's claw marks. But there were no bears in my part of Michigan. Odd. So being the curious 13-year-old I was, I continued on my way to find this distressed animal. I was walking along the edge of R's woods, trying not to go too far. I'm starting to get frustrated. Where the heck was this scream coming from? So being the naive little girl I was, I mimicked the noise right back at the animal, to see if it would show itself. Not a minute passes by, and I hear a noise that I would never forget. It sounded like a dog's growl, mixed with a buck's grunt. No deer sounded like it. Something in my brain told me to get the heck out of there, and I did. Leaping over twigs and branches until I'm in R's front yard. As I make my way towards his house, I hear the growl coming from the woods, about 10 meters behind me. So instead, I run towards the research sack, since R wasn't at the house and the doors would most likely be locked. I knew that no one would believe me, so I just said that a deer growled at me. However, I have heard deer grunts and snorts all my life, and they do not even compare to what I heard this animal make. It didn't sound like a coyote or a dog either. Although I never saw anything, I believe that it was trying to lure me off the property to do who knows what. I'm guessing that it may have been a Wendigo, since they can mimic noises of other animals and even voices. I also live near the Great Lakes, a hot spot for Wendigo sightings. Maybe it was even a skinwalker, but they tend to be more in the western states, so whatever is in my woods, I don't know. But anytime I go there, I don't go there alone anymore. Don't just brush off something that seems odd. Always follow your gut. I probably sound crazy to you, but I've seen this thing twice within a 3-month span. After that, I moved in the area. Thank God. I was 16 and had just gotten my license, and my brother sold me a sweet 1989 T-top Camaro. I was told about an old auction house out in the middle of nowhere, because I was asking around about where people hung out, which turned out to be 1 mile behind where I lived. If you want, I can send you Google Map pictures on the roads where this encounter took place. So, I went to the auction and made friends with a guy named Bob. He asked for a ride home because he was trying to hook up with the auctioneer's daughter and let his ride go home without him. So, we were staying over late after the auction. It closed about 11 p.m., and it was pitch black when we finally left. As I was going down the road the auction was on, we came to a curb that was closer to the wood line than the straight way. As we started to go into the curb, Bob screamed to stop, so I slammed on the brakes thinking he was crazy. Then he said, under his voice, "Look to the rats." As I did, I spotted a pair of glowing red eyes about 2 feet off the ground. I said, "Is that a coyote?" And Bob said the eye shine reminded of one. but coyotes were orange, not red. I said, well, do you have a weapon? And do you have a coyote permit? Which he said yes to both. It's not uncommon for people to carry concealed guns in the countryside of Kentucky. He pulled out a .22 long revolver from his coat, then stood up, out of the T-top, then draws his weapon and shoots, firing all 6 rounds to the spot with the eyes. He then replies to go grab our supper jokingly. I bent over to get a flashlight out of the glove box. As I bent over, I saw the eyes again, and they had gone from 2 feet to 8 feet tall. At that point, I smashed on the gas pedal, still bent over towards the glove box, and Bob screams, "What the hell, man?" I replied, "We will come back and get it in the morning." We went back to find no blood and no dead animal. What we did find, though, was one large-looking dog footprint and limbs broken off at about 7 feet tall, like if an 8-foot-tall human had walked through that brush. I never told anyone about this afterward.
This occurred last July. I remember this time frame so well because it happened the day after I saw Panic at the Disco at Madison Square Gardens. The day after the concert, so the 25th I think, I was playing Animal Crossing in my dad's house. He was at home, so I was the only other one in the house besides my cat. I heard a knock at the door. It was later in the afternoon, maybe around 6 p.m., so I started to walk to the door, not thinking about it. My dad's house has a large one-way window next to the door, so I was able to see who was outside. I assumed it was a kid from the neighborhood, so I opened the door. It was a boy. He looked a little lost, so I asked if he needed anything. He said no, and asked if he could come inside. I asked why, and he just shrugged and stood there with a blank expression. I was confused by this, and was torn on what to do. This boy was a child, only about 6 years old if I had to guess. I then remembered the whole stranger danger thing, even though it was a child and I'm a 19-year-old female. The boy asked if he could come in again, and I asked, "Why do you want to come in?" He gave me an answer, and it was kind of unsettling. He said something along the lines of, "My parents will come looking for me soon." I was confused and thought this boy was just terrified to be on his own. I looked at his eyes, for whatever reason, and the eye sockets were empty and black. I couldn't really tell why they were that way. It was so weird. My body began to speak almost on its own. A long story short, ended up letting him in. I couldn't stop myself. It was almost like pressure, or he was making me do it or something. It was almost like a form of mind control. Even though I knew it felt so unlike me, as I was pretty anxious around new people that I've never met, especially some random child who had never shown up at your house before. He came inside. He sat on the chair in the entryway. I was uncomfortable, and I could tell this child did not want to speak at all. I opened my DS to resume the game and it froze. I tried to turn it off and back on without saving my progress, and it wouldn't even do that. I brushed that off as a coincidence and just me being paranoid. After what felt like eons, the child stood up and said, "They are here." He got up, walked out of the door. I watched him get into the car, and as he was leaving, my dad was driving in front of the house, pulling into the driveway. My dad got inside and asked who that boy was. I responded with the whole story minus the black eyes and my DS not working, because my dad is skeptic about that kind of stuff. I then made up that I called the boy's parents to come pick him up. That was obviously a lie. I told my friend about this, the one who is very into cryptids and all things unknown. She thinks that I probably had an experience with black-eyed children. I'm no paranormal expert, but it felt very unhuman-like. I've never seen the child with completely black eyes who seems so lifeless. Anyways, thank you for reading my story. I hope it makes it onto a video. About 10 years ago, me and my best friend decided to stop by a local hangout of ours in Bowie, Maryland. We grew up here and spent our early years wandering the railroad tracks and woods, smoking and drinking as children do. So this one spot is a railroad overpass at 450 and 197. There's a parking lot and a small area of grass and trees, about 30-foot strip of land separating the tracks and the lot. So it's nighttime when we decide to go there and smoke a cigarette. We go in the tracks and we're facing the parking lot. So the overpass is to our left and the tracks go on to our right. Now we're smoking, and he's talking, but the entire time I'm focused to my right, peering down this track because I have the strangest feeling. I didn't know what it was until later, and it was the feeling of being washed by a predator. I've never really experienced this before. After about 2 minutes, we're almost done with our cigarettes. A helicopter flies right above us, seemingly at tree level, with a spotlight going right over us coming from the direction of the overpass. Not 10 seconds later, I hear the gravel shift from between the tracks, and I look forward to the overpass. Standing right in the center of the overpass, there is a giant silhouette. Now, since it is dark and it's under the overpass, I can only see its silhouette. It had to be at least 8 or 9 feet tall and burly looking. It was huge, and we only got a good look at it for a few seconds before I got creeped out and said, "Let's go." Now we hurriedly started rushing away, and we hear the gravel move closer, and not 3 seconds later we both hear the most demonic, horrifying, multiplied pitch screech we've ever heard. It was literally right behind our heads. It came from no more than a foot behind us. So of course we book it to his car. And no, we didn't look back because are you freaking kidding me? Get real. That's terrifying. I didn't want to see what made that noise, and I doubt you would want to either. We get to his car, and funny thing is, his lanyard got stuck around the steering wheel, and when we pulled out, his keys pulled out of the ignition as he turned the steering wheel. Anyways, we drive around for an hour. Only thing we could do is say, "What the heck?" And that's my encounter with what I think could be Goatman. Now, about a week later, we're hanging out with our friend, Andy. Now, Andy has spent a lot of time in the woods, and he was telling us about how last week the cops were out in the woods because they heard screams and thought a woman was being raped or something. Though I asked him if they had helicopters out, and he said yes. And I asked him if it was the day that we saw this Goatman. It was, so it's pretty weird. I have never shared this story with anyone before. Keep in mind, this is 100% true. I'm a very experienced hunter and have been hunting since I was 7. I have never encountered anything this strange until the fall of 2017. I woke up at 4 a.m. in the morning to get an early start. I like to get to my tree stand before daylight so I don't spook any of the deer in the area. I noticed that it was very quiet that morning. No bugs were making their usual noises. No early morning birds were chirping like they usually do. I thought it was kind of creepy, but nothing I should be concerned about. I climbed into my tree stand and got settled. I still had about an hour before daylight, so I figured I would get into that half-asleep, half-awake state for a while. After about 30 minutes, I heard footsteps really far away. I could hear them clearly, since there was still not a sound going on around me. I figured it wasn't just a deer. I went back to sleep. I next felt my tree stand shake a little. I thought that was weird, seeing as it could not hear or feel any wind. I looked down and saw a black outline of a person standing at the bottom of my tree, looking up at me. I thought, what the hell is he doing? As I looked for my flashlight, I got out my flashlight and turned it on, which I really regret doing. Where I turned it on, I saw a big hairy thing standing at the bottom of my stand. It growled and started shaking the tree stand all about. I had my handgun in my holster on my waist. I pulled it out and shot 2 shots into the ground about 5 feet away from it. It ran until I couldn't see it with my flashlight. About 10 seconds later, I heard a deep, long roar. After more footsteps going over the hill, I haven't gone back since. I still hunt, but nowhere near that location for fear I might come into contact with whatever that was again.
To start off, I'm a young man, and I have been a Christian for many years now, and would consider myself very strong in the faith. I've also seen many things that I can only hope that not many other people ever will. Now, my tales are not exactly a single story, but yet a compilation of a few experiences that are strongly connected. From a very young age, I have been followed or rather stalked by a creature that I could not identify until years after my first experience. One of the earliest memories that I have is of me laying on the top bunk of my bunk bed with my younger sister under me. My older sister was in the room adjacent from me, and my parents were in the room at the end of the hall. I remember awakening in bed and glancing around to see what had awakened me. I looked at the glowing blue numbers on my alarm clock, 4:25 a.m. My eyes then shifted to the dark hallway, lit only by a small night light, emitting a faint orange light. Then, I realized what had awakened me, as I could hear a deep voice coming from the hall. It began to speak in Toss. I, to this day, cannot understand what it was saying. I felt as if the voice were speaking to me, as if it only wanted me to awake to hear its gravelly lullaby. I slid down the ladder, then checked on my sisters. Both were still asleep. Thinking it could have been my dad or the TV, I snuck into my parents' room. Both were in deep sleep when the TV was black and turned off. Still curious, I went downstairs to see if that TV was left on as well. To my avail, it wasn't. And so, the child I was, terrified of the unknown in the dark, I bolted up the stairs. As I lay in my bed, I could still hear the deep, gravelly voice in the hall. Years later, it was the summer and I was 10. My family moved, and though I still had the bunk bed, I had my own room with a huge window. At the time, I had blinds over the window, which still let tons of light in, but regardless, I had that. Because it was the summer, I had been sleeping in, probably about 11. I remember laying on the top bunk with the ladder and the window both right above my head. I remember laying on the top bunk with the ladder and the window both right off my head. I remember awakening with a jolt and instantly sitting up and turning right, all in one motion, only to see a completely black silhouette of a man with large white eyes climbing the ladder of my bed. In the same second that I did this, I awoke for real, in the same exact thing, seeing the same exact figure, all in the same second. Like mentioned, this entire thing happened in 1 second, and I have come to the realization that the first joke was a dream, and the second was actually me waking up. I yet again repeated, but without ever laying back down. Of course, the instant I blinked, the shadow was gone. I have considered this being sleep paralysis, except I was far from being paralyzed. Now for the part where I connect these two stories and tell a new one all at once. This happened the summer I was 12, and this summer was packed full of these encounters, so I'll only tell the most dramatic. It was night, and I was up later than anyone else in my family due to the fact that there was no school for months. It was pretty late, and after I finally decided to sleep, I laid in my bed, no longer the bunk bed, and see a figure in the corner. It was the same exact figure I saw just 2 years earlier, and yet again, he just stared for a while before he began to speak in that same, deep gravelly voice that I heard so many years before. Yet again, he spoke in a language unknown to man. But, to compare it to something, it sounds really similar to the language the orcs in the Lord of the Rings speak. He just stops there, immersed in shadow, and spoke to me. I sat in horror for maybe 5 minutes, maybe an hour, I don't know. To be honest, it felt like forever. After he was done, he went silent and laid back into the shadows until he was devoured by them. I lay there still for hours before exhaustion got the best of me. It was about this time in my life that when I tried to classify this creature into some category of animal, I came up empty-handed. It was then that I felt enough connections between this creature and the demons described in the Bible to classify it as maybe possibly being one. After I realized that it was a demon that had been plaguing my nights, I began to look for them in the Bible and read as much of them as I could. I found most of my stuff in New Testament and a little in the Old Testament. I learned how to scare them off and how to get them to leave. This skill became essential as time went on, and as it took my life back, I could see that they were getting more and more brave as the years went on. One night, I was practicing my double bass for orchestra in our office. After a while, I saw a small, what I could only say demon, sitting by the cabinet. It was only about 1 to 2 feet tall, stood there and growled at me. He began to let out what I can only describe as like a scream or a whine or a wail all mixed together. It tried to lash out and strike at me. After about a minute of me watching this, I finally yelled, "In the name of Lord Jesus Christ, be gone." And with that, it shrieked and ran away. That was my first time getting rid of what I can only describe as a demon, and I owe it to finding out how to do it in the Bible. My final encounter that I feel comfortable sharing was also in the same summer. Once again, I was in my bed near the end of summer, and after I lay down, I once more see the demon standing in the same corner as last time. Also, just like last time, he stood for about a minute before speaking. However, after about a minute of this, he rose his left arm and pointed out my open window. I looked out, and it looked like I could see more shadows of somewhat human-looking creatures. Except these ones were taller, maybe 8 to 10 feet tall, muscular, and rotten-looking. It was really creepy, and to this day I don't really think I can give you a solid description. I'm still encountering these things every once in a while. I have also come to the realization that they are constantly surrounding us, yet they only occasionally unveil themselves for our eyes. I wish you all a good day and hope that you never encounter what I have. This is not my story but my cousin's, and I thought people would enjoy it. This story happened to me back in the summer of 2010. I was working for a major landscaping company, and the crew I was a part of was the smallest crew. There was just 3 of us. Our job was to prepare new locations for landscaping. We always got to the really cool locations and pretty much do nothing all day, except small stuff, planting grass, watering trees, etc. Anyway, you get the point. We had been dispatched to a new warehouse that was being built. The grounds were absolutely massive, so we had a lot of ground to cover. We started early in the morning around 8 a.m. The day seemed like it was going by quick. Just to note, the warehouse was in the middle of nowhere. Well, that's what it felt like anyway. I do remember that in the distance I could see a row of massive electric tower lines, maybe 300 yards or so away, and from there, a clear sky. Around lunchtime, the other guys wanted to go grab some lunch. I had brought my lunch from home, so I agreed to stay with the trailer. They took off and I began to sit against a trailer and eat my lunch. I was facing the power lines. I noticed something coming in the distance. At first, it looked like a black glider, but I didn't understand why anyone would be using a glider so close to power lines. I saw this jet black glider fly over the power lines. Now this quote-unquote glider was maybe 100 yards away. To my shock, I noticed this was no glider, but a bird. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. How could a bird be this big? The bird then took a quick U-turn and started back from where it came. I took off towards this thing. It was of course way too fast for me to catch. It flapped its wings and took off, just missing the power lines it seemed. In my quick dash, I noticed I had dropped my old flip phone, which I was going to use to attempt a video of this thing. I have seen a California condor, I have seen a crane, and turkey vulture. This was nothing that even comes close. This thing was 10 times the size. To gather a good perspective of its size, I would say that it was at the very least 30 feet in wingspan. So, it's definitely interesting, and I don't know what it was. I've done some reading, and I think it could be a thunderbird, but I don't know.